The challenges of development are very challenging. The first challenge was developing a strong economy. Because the most developing countries had traditional economies, their traditions got in the way of a free enterprise market. When the governments of these developing countries tried to educate their citizens and get literacy and stuff, they had to loan large amounts of money from the global north or already developed world. They then had trouble paying off their loans. Since the 1980s, leaders from the global north have required many countries to sell off government businesses and to pursue development as market economies. These third world countries didn't even start off as market economies. They were socialist. That would have been horrible for quality of life. Would it have not?
One thing that improved the quality of life was the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution began in the 1950s. It involved commercially improved seeds, pesticides, and different mechanical equipment, one of them being the tractor. These were all introduced in many parts of the new developing world. The Green Revolution increased a lot of agricultural production in countries such as Brazil and India, and many other countries, and this fed a lot more people around the world. Sadly, the big landowners were the only ones that could afford these new tools and methods. Because they farmed more land, they could also grow crops a lot more cheaply than those who still farmed in the traditional ways and farmed on small plots. Because of this, the prices for crops dropped significantly below what smaller farmers needed to be paid to make their living. Many of them were forced to sell their land to the big landowners and were forced to move to different cities. Economic development has made great changes all throughout the developing world. All across the developing world, women's roles have been evolving in many ways, and the traditional ways of life have brought new opportunities for women. Many different women, like Chandrika Kumaratanga, and other women that I can't pronounce their names, have become political leaders. Although women are still less likely than men to have a good education, this gap has narrowed quite a bit. These women are entering the workforce, and these growing numbers are really contributing their skills to their nation's wealths. Religion has also influenced the societies. Some of the religious leaders are called fundamentalists because they call for a return to what they see as the fundamental or basic values of their faiths. Cities have also rapidly grew. In different African, Asian, and Latin American nations, people have been flooding into the cities such as Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Mumbai, India, to find jobs and to escape the rural poverty. Sadly though, with no money and very few jobs, these newcomers often settle into shanty towns. These shanty towns are slums and flimsy shacks, and they're quite crowded and dangerous. They lack basic services, such as running water, electricity, and sewers, and drugs and crimes are constant threats.
Section 2. Africa seeks a better future. Making economic choices like socialism versus capitalism, many newly independent nations chose socialism, a system in which the government controls parts of the economy. Other nations relied on capitalism or market economies with private ownership of property as a path of development. These countries often had more efficient economies, but they allowed more profit to be taken out of the country by foreign owners. Now, many of these governments relied on cash crops, and there was a choice here. You could choose cash crops or you could choose food, because cash crops, they took away land that could be used for growing food. Now, African nations also faced obstacles to well-being, such as drought, which led to desertification, which meant that your farmland would turn into desert. The AIDS epidemic, which is killing millions and millions of people, and people moving to cities, which is pretty bad because, first of all, you don't really have enough food to feed your people, and then second of all, when they're all living in the same place, it's just going to be pretty hectic and not very good for disease and such. In addition, Africa is facing large environmental threats like animals going extinct because of their skins and deforestation. And Africa's main problem is they don't really have sustainable development as of right now. However, in Kenya, an environmental activist named Wangari Maathai challenged governmental policy by starting the Green Belt movement. She worked with local women on projects of sustainable development. This is economic development that aims to provide lasting well-being for future generations rather than short-term goals.
Section 3. China and India, two giants of Asia. China and India are two giant countries and are home to over 2/5 of the world's people. These giant nations dominate Asia economically as well. In 1976, the Chinese leader Mao Zedong died, and Deng Xiaoping took over. Deng was a practical reformer and really wanted to improve the economy. Deng's program, called the Four Modernizations, really emphasized agriculture, industry, science, and defense. In the late 1980s, there were many rebellions against communist leaders such as Deng. In 1989, thousands of demonstrators, lots of them being students, occupied a place called Tiananmen Square. This was a huge plaza at the center of China's capital, Beijing. The demonstrators refused to disperse, and it led to the government having to come in to get them out. Many people were killed and wounded, and it was then known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. China faces a lot of challenges today as well. They have a giant population in China, more than 1.3 billion people. And recently, they've implemented the one-child policy. This limits families to one single child. Human rights have also suffered a lot in China due to the communists. India was quite a bit different than China, though.
And India begins to build its economy. As India's population grows, so does their agriculture and industry. They set out to use modern technology to expand them. The government adopted elements of a command economy, using 5-year plans to set economic goals and manage resources. However, development was uneven. While it developed some industries, India lacked oil and natural gas, key resources for economic growth. Instead, it had to rely on costly imported oil. And so the Green Revolution really affected India for agriculture to feed its people and its growing population. It was very beneficial for them. India's rapid population growth really affected the living conditions of its people. Because of the rapidly growing population, it led to lots of unemployment, and overall, a lot of people were impoverished under India. However, this led to the rise of a Catholic nun known as Mother Teresa, who mainly focused on helping the urban poor. Although there is now widespread education and a modern economy, most Indians still live in villages and follow the traditional ways. India's constitution banned discrimination against people in the lowest social class. However, the government set aside jobs and places in the universities for them. However, because prejudice and discrimination persist, higher caste Hindus generally receive better schooling and jobs. Our story in Latin America, just like many other developing areas, begins with poverty. From the 1950s to the 1980s, economic development failed to change deep-rooted inequalities in many Latin American countries. However, the government did try to equal this inequality by promoting industry and agriculture. The Green Revolution definitely benefited Latin America by allowing them to export many of the unique crops that are grown in the area. However, the gap between the rich and poor still grew because of the amount of money it took to be able to grow large amounts of these cash crops. A key feature of Latin America has always been the uneven distribution of wealth. In many countries, a tiny elite has controlled the land, businesses, and factories. In addition, the poverty of these lower income people threatens livelihoods. Because of the quick population growth of Latin America, the shortage of land in rural areas drove many farmers into the cities, which just led to the shantytown problem that we had seen in Africa earlier. However, like we've seen in India, religions reach out to the poor when times seem bleakest. The Catholic Church has remained a powerful force throughout Latin America ever since Europeans first set foot on those shores. Under much social unrest in these Latin American countries, many military rulers decided they needed to seize power now. And as they did, they often established a command economy with a socialist/communist government. But these Latin American countries are still part of the Organization of American States, a group formed in 1948 to promote democracy and economic cooperation. So, after many years of communism and socialism rule, about in the 1990s, many Latin American countries finally changed to a democratic government, such as Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. This